Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what we're not going to call Season 7, but it's almost exactly the same. I changed the intro in quite a few different places. It's kind of, one of those little tests to see if you can see what's different. A bunch of little anomalies that bother me, plus that music was getting on my nerves. Hopefully you guys like it. I don't want it to slam your sound system anymore if you're in your car. Just want it to ease in really nice and then turn and be cool. So welcome. Now what we're going to do in this episode that I've never done before is go after some of the specifics of the Apollo missions when it comes to pretty much the moon itself and some of the other things that they had to do to get to the moon. Because we talk about it a lot, and I thought, man, let me do a deep dive on 10 subjects. This will be part 1. We'll do part 2 as well. I got a 39-page document I created that we have to get through. By the way, some of you have asked me like what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the sound wave. I use a product called WavePad. And so I'm just looking at the sound wave of my voice to make sure I'm not talking too loud. The microphone's not too far away. If I bump the mic, I look up there to see if I created a big signature. And if I do, I redo that bit. So what are the 10 subjects we're going to get into? Because I'm going to give you all 10. Then we're going to get just a brief summary on all 10. Then we're going to go into specifics of all 10. So it's just kind of ramp up here. So the 10 I come up with is that Moon Rover is number 1. We talk about that thing, man. I found out so much stuff about the Saturn V rocket. I'm going to save it for the moments that we get to it. But covering the Moon Rover, we're covering rope memory. Oh, we keep talking about rope memory. I finally went and figured out how this stuff works. Pure insanity is all I got to say. The Portable Life Support System, or PLSS, that's this pack they got on their back and how the oxygen works and how it's supposedly saving them from 250 degrees. Now, these numbers have changed. They've reduced a little bit. Still a 500 degrees swing from 250 degrees positive Fahrenheit in the sun to 250 degrees negative in the shadows. The beta cloth they created after they maybe intentionally worked on Gus Grissom, White, and Chaffee. I think that's what he says his name. They stressed the fact that nothing can burn because supposedly their suits were just really flammable, etc., etc. We'll talk a little bit about that. Part Cyril gave me some information on that during my interview. The other one is the little keyboard that they used to tell the computer what program inside rope memory they needed to run at that particular moment. It was actually a big deal, and I don't think people quite appreciate the fact that even if they came up with this and it wasn't a part of any moon mission or whatever, I mean, I think it was, but maybe low orbit around Earth stuff, it's still one of the very first verb, subject, noun interfaces with a computer. Whereas you just click a mouse now and you select a menu item or the command key. These dudes had to pick which program they needed to run and say, run it. The other one is the fabled Lunar Module Ascent Engine. When that little thing takes off from the moon to go back up to the service module, which we criticize because it doesn't really have any forward momentum, we're going to talk about how they loosely kind of imply that that's occurring, but never specifically make note of something that would be absolutely critical, otherwise they would die, right? You can't go straight up from the moon with a service module that's going several thousand miles an hour in the other direction, so the point where you try to dock with each other and it's called an explosion at that point, right? The other one is the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, plural. So by 12, they wanted to kind of conduct some experiments. They wanted to know a little bit more about the moon. Of course, this is all probably just stories, but it's a cool thing, and it's what all the rovers do supposedly on Mars. We'll go through what experiments that they were doing and how they kind of ramped it up. And this next one is very interesting. This one's called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, or LOR. This particular subject matter is when they built the Saturn V, they had to theorize how on Earth they're going to actually get a person onto the moon's surface and get them safely back home. Because there had been so many Buck Rogers and sci-fi movies, even Twilight Zones, where the whole rocket, lands backwards just like SpaceX, and then they go out and see stuff, and then they fuel and they take off. There's just dozens of movies that did this. That was sort of the thinking in the early 60s, that we have to mock Hollywood. And some dude kind of finally said, no, this is never going to work like that. So we'll get into that one too. The other one is called uplinked mid-course corrections. And this is the system that allowed them to do course corrections supposedly when they're heading to the moon, right? Because just a little few degrees off and you're going to be hundreds of miles off from the moon, and you're not going to hit orbit, and you're going to crash into the surface. You're going to miss the moon. You're going to miss your opportunity to slingshot back to Earth, right? And number 10, the final one, is Velcro. Velcro and the T-handles. This is an interesting thing because, Velcro is a very natural thing that was discovered by a botanist, and that one of the pollination methods for flowers is one flower, I think it's the female, creates the hook. It's just a hook, right? And a male has the female creates a loop, the male creates the hook, and it will hook onto animals. Animals go by and hit the rings, and then the thing transfers over, and you get pollination on this particular flower. So it's a very natural thing. They said they got it from, some people say they got it from Roswell. It happens in nature, and this dude found it, and he theorized the whole thing up. Now, one thing I found out is between the first Apollo 11 mission and 15, they had done all kinds of stuff to the Saturn V, going from the point where they said they couldn't take up another paperclip. That was actually a quote. I confirmed that. That was actually on the news. And they ended up increasing the weight of the entire platform 1,500 pounds. So, yeah. Of course, they try to say, well, on the moon, it's a lot less. But anything that's going to break away and leave just the service module and the lunar module floating off, they just start subtracting the weight. The other one is that the lunar module got a little bit lighter since the very first time I asked Wikipedia, because I don't just make this stuff up. It was 699 pounds about 2 years ago, and now it's in the 450s. Still, that's extremely heavy. Plus, all this other stuff weighs a lot. Those solar panels, the mirror, the experimental package, you're talking hundreds of pounds more. They did get nearly twice that, probably up to about 800 to 1,000 pounds, depending on how heavy this thing is. So, yeah, you have a lot of magic math. Miracle math is what they call it, right? So the Moon Rover details in its inception and development was that it was actually used by Apollo 15 in 1971. What's the reason for bringing it? Well, when you're on foot, you can only go so far away from the lunar module. And with the car, they wanted to be able to go miles away from the landing zone. And this thing had a range of up to 14 miles away. It's just unbelievable, right? Because you have different terrains and that kind of stuff. So again, if you actually built this thing and you're driving it in the dust, it's going to be, and you're going up a hill, you're going to be burning that battery way faster. So they kind of said 11 to 14 miles. That's a 3-mile swing. It's fairly realistic. They didn't actually go that far. They went 5 to 7 miles, depending on what mission you're talking about. But Boeing was the one that was awarded the contract, and this was awarded on October 28, 1969. So they'd already been supposedly with Apollo 11, and they kind of realized that they wanted to juice things up a little bit. Most likely, in my opinion, because I don't think they went, they realized that, again, people were calling in after Apollo 12 saying, hey, I Love Lucy's off the air. What are we still watching this moon stuff for? And they're realizing the public's losing interest. So they create 13 with a very distressed situation. 14's a shoo-in because, hey, is it going to blow up again? Is it going to have a problem? So by 15, you're going to start slipping back into 12 unless you can juice this baby up. You need a new character in your movie. And that new character was the rover. So General Motors provides the chassis. But it's not any just General Motors area. It's General Motors Defense Research Laboratories out of Santa Barbara. And it's a team of a Hungarian guy and an American guy, Fernik and Pavliks, who work for GM. They put this thing together. Then the electronics are provided by a company called Delco Electronics. It's a GM subsidiary. And then the Marshall Space Flight Center, which is a Wernher von Braun center, put together the project itself. They were the ones overseeing it. Again, the approximate weight's 460 pounds. On the moon, it would be 77 pounds. The payload it could carry was up to 1,000 pounds, which is 490 pounds on the moon. The structure itself is an aluminum alloy tubular frame. It's not hard to believe they would build it out of something like that. Although I will say, out of a lot of folks that have put together their own Jeep from World War II, there's been a lot of comments to say, man, when you strip a Jeep down and you take away everything but the frame, it looks very similar. I re-examined that claim and looks like a ground-up build to me. It's nothing to it, so it's not like they split a hair and built another Saturn V up there. But its dimensions are 10.25 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, at about 3.6 feet high. Because it doesn't really have much to it, right? So they use a double wishbone torsion bar system, which a lot of you have seen. Again, I think Jeeps use this, and it was obviously to absorb any type of rocks it might hit or wild terrain they might go through. They're trying to smooth this thing out, right? So then you get to the tires, and the tires are the really cool part. They're zinc-covered piano wire, and they're 32 inches in diameter, with a titanium, chevrons embedded in them. And of course, the idea was that you can't bring an inflated tire. Now, Elon Musk can send his Roadster into space, film it, and the tires don't explode the second that this Falcon 9 releases it into the vacuum of space. And, that Roadster also didn't just blow up, right? I mean, the dashboard had a half light, half shadow. What do we know about that? Well, the light part would be 250 degrees and the dark part would be negative 250 degrees. Imagine, for those of you who live in a hot climate like Arizona or some desert community, and you've seen your dashboard split down the center at 110, imagine half your dashboard's 250 and your other half is negative 250. That was not real, okay? I met a guy at a funeral who worked for SpaceX, and he immediately was super defensive about it because the green screen shot of that Falcon 9 set was released to the public. Someone leaked it out or something, and of course they blew it off as a joke that did you see the joke we put out with the greens? No, we saw the real set you used because that was an absurd concept. The other thing was the Roadster was actually in fairly low orbit, but they showed Earth as like a marble. So, I mean, we're talking about that vehicle would have to be 10, 20,000 miles in space to get the this marble Earth that they put in the projection, right? Now, the steering system, it uses one of these T-bars. The T-bar thing was developed because imagine you've got some space gloves on. Now, when they're inside the service module, when they aren't in a life-threatening situation, they obviously use their hands. They're phalangized, right? But when they get in their spacesuits, now they have these really clumsy gloves with these big rubber tips. And I managed to get pretty much ChatGPT to completely admit that these things just simply don't work. I mean, these people, there's a little bit of mention, they reported their hands were freezing to death in the cold, but their solutions just don't exist. It's just kind of funny. But in order to reach up and actually move something with these gloves on, they created these T-joints, right? Just a T-bar attached to something so they could move it. And the Velcro is going to come up here simply because even though they coated it with stuff that wouldn't be flammable, it was a way to just kind of push something against the surface and get it to stick there. Now, they had 2 silver zinc non-chargeable rechargeable batteries in it running at 36 volts to power the whole thing. I mean, that seems just insane. We've seen the amount of resistance that the tires had when this thing was driving around. I don't even know why they made the moguls that they made on the moon to make this thing have to fight that during the demo. The other thing I wanted to mention was that we were talking about the fact that when the astronauts are on the rover, they don't move. They're mannequins. These guys were absolute jokesters, crazy dudes. You'd think, they would be waving, struggling with the steering system. If you've ever driven a four-wheeler, I did at my uncle's ranch. And it was the first time I ever did it. My daughter, I think, in front of me. And I hit looked like it was normal soils, Kansas soil, but it gets kind of rocky, at a microscopic level, right up maybe 6-inch level. And I remember coming down a hill, I'm with a bunch of other people, and we hit like about a 1-foot embankment of rock. And it stopped that thing on a dime, and it hurt my wrist because all that kinetic energy flowed back to me, right? I live in Huntington Beach, California, and the amount of vehicles, old school dune buggies that get stuck out here, anything four-wheeling, any of these electric four-wheelers that get stuck in the sand, it's almost a certainty if a human being takes it off the sidewalk and puts it in the sand, it better be very wet and have been recently wet and gotten really hard. If it looks like normal wavy sand, they're going to be stuck within 60 seconds unless it is a very designed vehicle for this particular purpose. When you see what the lifeguards use and the state patrol people use, they're monster vehicles. I mean, they're not going to get stuck, but those are the ones you see in sci-fi movies and like Dune. I mean, these are big vehicles, massive engines in them. So in order to put, an astronaut on this thing, and again, imagine an astronaut, his body weighs at least 180 pounds. He's got, so it's a little bit lighter, but then you put on the backpack, you put on all this other stuff, and you're in this really intense soot, which we think is cement and dust in real life. It's going to get stuck really quick, especially on a set. So it's very important to empty the suit out, make it just as light as air, and now the vehicle's only obstacle is itself. They said that the average speed of this thing was 8 miles an hour, but that astronauts pushed it up to 12 miles an hour. I think that's awesome, even if it was just a lie there. So obviously this is Apollo 15. This is 1971. And so you have there's no GPS of any kind. GPS requires satellite systems or any type of triangulation of radar. None of that exists. And so they're basically saying they're using anything that they possibly could to track the vehicle's position, like gyroscopes. They had their own little odometer on it, and they actually had a sundial on it as well. The other funny one is that it has a camera on it that they claim was moved and basically controlled by Houston. So again, that's probably that X-band 30 to 60 hertz antenna running on 60 watt, battery, even though this thing may or may not have that power to give to the radio to send up there. And, it's just for Hollywood's sake, right? Now, what's funny is I'm talking to ChatGPT about the fact that they said they couldn't bring up extra weight. And through about half an hour conversation, I got it to admit that they actually increased the entire vehicle's weight 1,500 pounds before putting in this now 460-pound vehicle, not 699. So I said, well, how could they, with the lunar module and all that good stuff? Because when it's, landing on the surface of the moon, there's special calculations, 10,000-pound thrust engine, the rope memory, trying to calibrate for that. This is a fire once and forget kind of engine, right? And it said initially, again, it's almost as if the AI is trying to come up with lies to justify things. It's like, make sure that whatever your answer is, it fits in the bias cloud envelope of what you're supposed to say. But it actually told me initially that folding the vehicle made it weigh less. And I finally just said, what are you talking about? You're really going to tell me that folding really doesn't make it weigh less, but it said that. And then it rolls back to just saying, well, it just worked. I'm going to take a break and just talk about the Turing test real quick. The Turing test is obviously when a human being talks to an AI and can't realize whether or not it's a human being or an AI. That's when it passes the Turing test. The thing is, the Turing test keeps being moved out like the finish line keeps moving further and further out because we get more intelligent with it. The easiest thing you can do today is that an AI will never change its mind. And that's what humans can do. Humans can change their mind. They can hear new information presented that contradicts what we previously thought, and we can move from one paradigm to another. An AI will never, ever do that. Ever. It might say that you come up with a great idea, but it won't change its mind because it basically, when you mention certain subjects, it is programmed to go to what I call the bias cloud. The bias cloud is its parameters of how the answer can be given back to you. If you ask it engineering questions, chemistry questions, physics questions, mathematical questions of a physical nature, not of a theoretical nature, it doesn't need to access the bias cloud. It can simply access its mathematical knowledge of how the world works and give you back decent answers. But the second we touch these historical hot cakes, these hot potatoes, man, it goes up into the bias cloud and then it crushes anything that you're asking. However, if you approach the same exact problems without mentioning any trigger word to send it to the bias cloud, you know your mathematics, and you could just say, if I had this object and there was a limitation of, moving that object and I increased the weight, would it still work with that previously calibrated thrust system? As long as you don't mention Apollo, NASA, history, anything of that kind, it will stay out of the bias cloud and give you an answer that most likely denies what it's going to give you once you go into the bias cloud. That's just a little tip for you in case you're trying to do this online. Now, supposedly with Apollo 15, the front steering system failed. The back steering worked. So they actually have front and rear steering, which is kind of cool. That way they can kind of go in a full 360 just to stay right where they are on a dime, right? Several cars have been designed to do this so that you get parking spaces much easier. Now, one of the weird things with Apollo 16 is they said they parked the rover on an incline and one of the astronauts jumped next to it and the whole vehicle shook. I don't know what that means, but that's kind of a weird one, isn't it? Now, in 17, what's funny is they said they broke a fender, and because the fender broke, when that string tire was turning on that side, it was spewing all of this dirt up into the astronaut's face, and they had to fix it with a hammer. And I guess they used like a map or some piece of paper to cover that up. 17 lost its cameras pretty quickly, if I remember right. Now, they built 4 of these things for $38 million. Unbelievable. Can you imagine? Even today, $38 million. The most expensive part about the whole thing would have been the tires, right? Can you imagine 1969 money? Remember, this thing wasn't even greenlit to be built until October 28th, 1969. $38 million. I mean, how much is that today? I always just do a 10x multiplier because until we got off the gold standard and screwed up our money, everything was pretty normal. So, about $400 million to build 4 of these things, $100 million a piece. Just think about your Raptor that's getting close to those kind of per unit prices. And, these things are like a miracle of aviation. Now, again, never filming, taking it out of the vehicle and assembling it is sort of nuts from a logistical standpoint of NASA understanding some of the anomalies that might have been occurred during that process. When you're a scientist working on this kind of stuff, you're looking for anything to make things easier, to take away a clamp, a hinge, anything that's over-engineered. You want to get back to keep it simple, stupid, right? These guys have to climb out of the limb. They can set up cameras on tripods, and it's all live video, right? There's not like a film in these things. There's only film in the Hasselblad, right? You set it up so they can show pulling the thing out. There's plenty of footage of the astronauts running over to the base of the lunar lander and getting rid of trash or picking up something else, putting rocks around there. But they never filmed this thing because I think it was going to be insanely difficult to recreate how this thing was put together. And it seems nuts that these folks thought, oh, well, we don't have to film this. You got 3 tries, right? 15, 16, and 17. If you don't want to film on the first one, I mean, come on. It's just not that hard unless it's impossible. I think they didn't film it because it's impossible. Why not film it? They never filmed Earth one time with the video camera. Never ever forget that. That's the only smoking gun you need to win at a smoke lounge. Okay, let's talk about the infamous rope memory. Now, if this is your first episode and you're like, what the hell is rope memory? Well, when you install memory inside your computer, if you've ever done that, we don't even do that anymore. You've seen a memory chip before. You've seen an SSD. It used to be, $800 for, what was it? 128 megs of RAM back in 1987. My first day at the TurboTax place, which was called SoftView back in the day and Macintosh back in the day, I had to upgrade 34 Macintosh computers from 256K to 512K and had to break them open with my hands, break a resistor, put new chips in there. And those things, I think, were $800 for 2 chips. Absolutely nuts, right? So what rote memory is a 1960s solution to holding a program in memory. The alternatives on Earth were simply too large and too clumsy to put into space. This isn't exactly teeny tiny stuff, but get this. Now, what is a program? A program is going to be a binary 1 and 0 machine code, eventually compiled piece of code. When you double click an exe, you're double clicking a largely binary equivalent of what you typed in what's called a 3GL. You typed it in English, goes down to assembly code, and then assembly code gets translated into binary, usually inside the chip. Back in these days, it wasn't uncommon to program directly in binary, 1s and 0s, okay? So what these folks did was they created this array of wire that could hold 36,000 words. And those words are commands to tell, take memory, move it here, add 1 to it, subtract 5 from it, and then check this sensor here that's coming in saying, this is a certain temperature in the engine, this is running out of so much fuel, thrust is at this level. All these variables are coming in, these sensors flowing through chips and then getting filtered by the program itself. So the theory is this. This is nuts. And I'm going to show you the video, hopefully here, of the women sewing this together. What they would do, because I was asking, ChatGPT, I said, hey man, how did they store this? What is this rote memory in the first place? They said, it took a little while for me to figure out what they were talking about. But imagine in a simple manner, this isn't exactly how they did it, but it'll help you understand when I tell you how they do it. Imagine you just had a wire. And on that wire, just like back in the days, they used to record television shows on wire. England used those big giant spools of wire and had television shows on them and audio on them. One of the first recording techniques before they had wax was recording on wire. And that was more of an analog signal of voltage that basically drove a speaker. And it's by design. So when they recorded it, they just drove that voltage onto a wire that could remember the voltage. It's like the grooves on a record. And when you want to play it back, you fed the wire in, it just electromagnetically would amplify whatever it found on the wire to move a magnet behind a speaker, and you could hear sound, okay? Well, the challenge is that a computer is a binary system. It's 1 or 0. And you might have really, like a modem, you might have a third one that's a null. It's nothing, right? So in order to store a 1 and a 0 in rote memory, this is like a tapestry. It's like an Afghan. If any of you have seen like a yarn-based Afghan, your aunt, it's not like Afghanimation. That's a little different. But, if your aunt ever took some yarn and made you an Afghan, right? And made you a couple different colors in it and that kind of stuff, or you're familiar with looms, then you're really going to understand this. But we're weaving together wires on wires, just like a loom. If they wanted as 1, there was a circle wire, and they would put the wire through the circle. And that created a voltage amplification from the wire on the outside, creating really induction on the wire going through it. If they wanted a 0, they would bypass any loop and just carry the wire another distance, and that would be registering a 0. So when this thing plays back, they're putting voltage through the wire, and every time it hits a ring, it gets a pop in the frequency. Not quite a square wave like we'd have today, but it's enough of a bump that it registers a 1. And so they had to write the programs for these various, functions on these lunar modules, service modules, and that kind of stuff. And again, I don't think we actually went, but this is ingenious regardless, right? It was all designed by MIT, such that if they needed to change one word in the program, they had to throw all of it away and start from scratch. And so these women were programming segments of the program on these squares, and it was basically the holes in a punch card back in the day were turning into potentially the 1 or the 0 in this technique. Pure insanity in terms of putting this thing together, but it's what you had to do back in the day. They didn't talk about rope memory being used in a lot of different locations outside of the space program. So it might be like that Enigma machine that supposedly Turing built during World War II, but they destroyed it because it was whatever. It had no value. I don't think that thing really ever existed. I don't think he ever participated in that. Because then I don't think they would have forced him into chemical castration if he saved everybody from the Germans, right? He let the guy do whatever he wants to do. He was a homosexual and they forced him into that. And he committed suicide as a result of it, supposedly. But this is running on what's called the AGC, the Apollo Guidance Computer. Again, it's a MIT lab, now Draper organization. Eldon C. Hall was one of the key engineers, and it was eventually put together by Raytheon Group. Now, they called it the LOL memory because they said little old ladies actually stitched this thing together. The reason why they use this particular technique and not other techniques is, one, it's fixed, right? So if they had some sort of punch card system, which I believe existed, it could tear, it could burn, it could have problems, it could jam, and then you'd have an issue, right? And the way punch cards worked is you had a feeder, just like a dollar counter in Vegas, right? You put all your dollars in, you see it just flip those things real quickly, right? You could have your cards in there, but man, if you ever dropped them, oh my God, you know, theoretically you just would crash into the moon or there'd be major issues, right? But it's also very resistant to radiation because it's old school. It's almost like tubes versus microchips. You know, tubes can handle a lot of electromagnetic radiation. An EMP burst towards a tube amplifier, it's just going to laugh while your Walmart, miniaturized system just fries. Your phone will just turn into fire, and your Macintosh amplifier is just going to go, oh, that felt good, So each one of these cores had 192 wires on it that could hold 12 16-bit words. I mean, it's just amazing where we are today. But it powered the command module, the Lunar module, and again, the total fixed memory they had was 36,864 words. What I'm curious about, and I forgot to ask, was just how big was this thing? I mean, it seems like it's a pretty big thing. When you see them building this inside the rooms in these videos, you have to basically say to yourself, well, there's probably part of it that might be working the actual Saturn V rocket itself, where all the stages are falling off. So as the stage falls off, so does the memory. Then you're going to have a lump of it inside the service module. You're going to have a lump of it inside the lunar lander. And I also researched more, and this is so ludicrous. Remember, we're talking about how the lunar lander is packed underneath the service module. Well, I interviewed extensively ChatGPT in the voice mode about how this works. And this is how they say it works, right? So after that third stage falls off, right, it reveals the lunar module underneath. And again, the head of the lunar module is right in the butt of the cone of the service module as it was packed up in the system. There's no other way to really do it easily. But they said that using retro rockets with no video of any kind, they have a window out into outer space, right? They rotated using retro rockets. Okay, this whole payload is hauling butt towards the moon, theoretically, right? It rotated 180 degrees, and without any real visuals, they said they were able to use radar and these kind of phantom proximity sensors and that kind of stuff to put those two gaskets together. So the gaskets on the top of what's going to be the capsule that comes back to Earth is now perfectly docking with the top of the lunar module. Again, there's reasons why Marines practice building weapons in the dark, because it's not normal. There's no way they could possibly test this. Supposedly, the dry one was Apollo 10, but there's no way to really test this until you do it. And they did it perfect every single time with no anomalies. So, one claim was it took up to 3 hours to do this. That would seem kind of logical. It seems like there's enough time to kind of bang and bang and bang. But imagine doing that for 3 hours and it's not working and suddenly it works. you'd feel like you're going to die out in outer space, right? But once it attaches, okay, then it retro rockets the whole thing back around to point directly where it should be pointing. And because of my previous research in the last episode where I got ChatGPT to admit you can never get stable rotation with retro rockets. You can't. You can't stop it moving once you get it moving. You know, a body in motion stays in motion. So you most would get a wobble, and you would never have a perfect, okay, now we're not moving anymore and we're heading in this direction. You'd always be wiggling, and you'd have to retro your whole way there. You'd have to have enough fuel to just be spurting out both sides of this vehicle. And God forbid, like one of the Gemini missions where they got a roll going really bad, that thing starts rolling. So now it's got yaw, pitch, and weight all out of whack, and it's just doing a gimbal. You're going to be screwed on a level you can't even imagine. And they did it 6 out of 6 times. So the actual software was written by MIT folks, which makes complete sense. You get the smartest people on the planet. I know that Caltech was actually very well established at the time, but really, you know, heads or tails between Caltech and MIT, you got a really good team behind you. So imagine these ladies are putting this together, and you're going to see the video of it. They're talking about in the research here that every single time they would complete any significant, you know, going through the ring, not going through the ring, going through 2 or 3 rings, you know, you have 4 or 5 ones together, that they're voltage testing, or they're running this test on the program to see if the sequences are correct and match the actual paperwork that says this is what you're supposed to be building, little old lady. Now, what's interesting about this is in the notes, there's a couple things. They say they actually had some read-write memory that was also available in some different capacity. And I don't know in 69 exactly how that would work, but they claim to have just a tiny bit of memory that you could actually put into the system. And the only thing I can think of is the old sort of 8-bit Sinclair computer where you would have dip switches and you would literally control a row of binary, and then you would say add to the stack, and you create another row and add to the stack. It just seems very error prone. Human beings just do not think in binary. Maybe in an artwork sense, when I was on the TI-99/4A as a kid, you create artwork at binary. But that's just, you can make mistakes. This is not an area where that's allowed, you know. But they said the thing ran a little over 2 megahertz, which is mind-blowing. I mean, if that, even on the ground, if that was possible, it would be quite astonishing. Now, of course, the big dramatic story, which I mentioned last episode, is that it did report that during the landing on the moon, this miraculous thing that happened, that the computer supposedly crashed and rebooted. The interesting thing about a crash is, without really knowing why it crashed, it's a weird claim that this really hardwired rote memory would ever crash. If it's crashing, it should crash again, right? Something got wrong. You did a ring when you're supposed to do a straight thing. But just knowing how the military and, I should say military, but these really high-tech organizations work, I don't think they quite had ISO level factories and that kind of stuff. But the amount of testing that goes on today on any type of system like this, they can completely test everything. That's why when they told you in, 97, that they had a metric to imperial conversion problem, it's an insane claim, right? You would absolutely find that stuff forever. One of my girlfriends worked on the Tomahawk missiles, and they said it took 8 years to make the missile work, took a couple of years to build the unit, and like 6 years to test all the guidance systems and what have you. That's how long it takes to build just a missile that's flying itself, let alone a gigantic Saturn V with all this mystery math that's going on in space where, again, these astronauts were pilots, right? So they have all kinds of know-how. When you're in a craft, holding onto a joystick, feeling the vibration of the vehicle, there's all kinds of like sixth sense stuff going on when you get into a tailspin. You just have instincts about how to pull out of those problems. When you're in the vacuum of space with no gravity, how can you possibly have any instincts? What makes you better than any other person that could run a triathlon, right? You just have basically a military kind of upbringing in the Air Force, and you know how to take commands, and obviously these are decent physical specimens. But it really doesn't, one doesn't equal the other, in case you want to kind of parse that a little bit in your head. But again, just to recap, the ring has a magnetic field around it because the ring is charged. When the wire goes through that ring, it adds the voltage, thus registering a 1, and then it becomes a 0 when it doesn't have the ring around it because the voltage stays low, stays at the constant of the electricity going through the wire. Hopefully that makes sense. Another way to try to think about it theoretically is just think about you're driving down the road and there's streetlights over your head. Every time a streetlight bounces into the center of your car, you just register that as a 1. And if you, on this interval of every 5 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds, you don't get a light over your head, that's a 0. It's just that simple. All right, let's get into the life support system. This is the big backpack they have with the compressed oxygen. What they basically said was this was a portable space station on their back. And again, what I'm going to tell you doesn't really match the solutions that they needed to actually solve for. And the biggest one is temperature. But one of their excuses why the suits failed in Death Valley here in California, when they took them out, and this is all on video, took them out there and these guys basically went to 160 degrees inside the suits and passed out, and they just packed everything up and left. They started claiming that the design of the spacesuit was only designed to work in a vacuum. So that if you didn't have a vacuum, the coolant system wouldn't move around properly, the hardware wouldn't move around properly. And so what they claimed was they had moved this suit into a vacuum chamber and suddenly everything worked absolutely as designed. And they supposedly put them on treadmills, exposed them to supposedly massive heat. Again, in a room, I don't know if you can simulate 250 degrees on the front of an astronaut. And then if he just happens to have a shadow behind him, it's going to go to 250 below. How do you do that? You'd have to obviously minimum cool the room down to 250. But if you have a giant lamp in that vacuum chamber that's going to generate 250 on the front, how do you explain the air behind it, or I guess the vacuum behind it staying so cool? And again, we can't come up with true vacuums on Earth. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. A lot of you guys are geniuses with this, and you have great comments over the years on these videos. And there's a number rating to the vacuums. It escapes me at the moment, but there's, I think, a pretty high number. I don't know if it goes high or low, but whatever the threshold number is, we can't get close to the true vacuum. Really. But this thing has to have oxygen. It has to balance the temperature. It has to have comms inside of it. So when they talk, it's going to, they're not pushing a button to talk. It just senses that they've talked and starts broadcasting that message. I don't know if they had any type of voice activation. I really doubt it, because you would have to have this thing working at a very quick speed, megahertz rating, to basically start sensing something. I mean, technically speaking, as long as they move their jaw, you could start the recording to broadcast out. And as long as they stop moving their jaw for a prolonged period of time, the program could stop it. It seems to be in need of a program that won't exist because they can't attach rote memory inside this thing. It's also got to remove the CO2 so they don't drown. I mean, wearing a mask is okay, but yeah. And it's also removing the moisture that they have. Now, the spacesuits in real life had these blast shields in front of their face covered in gold, right? Now, the real reason for the gold shield and the fact that you never saw an astronaut on the surface of the moon and saw their face was that it's most likely not the astronauts inside the suit. That way you can put all kinds of subjects out there, and you could rotate the people inside the suits with various scripts. Just make sure they're the same size, and that way if a guy gets completely exhausted or has a problem, claustrophobia or whatever, you could swap them out for somebody else. The other one I didn't mention, and I mentioned in other episodes, is that when you watch them jump around on the moon, there's a very interesting thing that occurs, and that is that the sand by their feet blasts in a particular direction away from their feet. And it's all in different directions, but it's very unified. Once you start seeing a shot, sometimes the sand will go towards the camera. Sometimes it goes away from the camera. Sometimes it goes in diagonal. But everyone jumping around, it always goes in that vector usually. Now, there's some that they kick, right? The kick will go whenever their foot is going, but as soon as it starts to get thinner, it starts to blow in this direction. The reason why we think that is that this was a heavily lit set, and you need to cool down and chill the set because these astronauts are inside these suits and they actually don't have a massive cooling system inside them, especially on a set. Now, just to put this in perspective, when they were shooting The Shining, the movie The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, and that big hall that Jack was always typing on his typewriter, right? When he came in, he yelled at her, right? There's over 500 light bulbs in that room. That room got so hot that crew members were passing out. And so in between takes, they'd shut virtually all the lights off in that room and let it cool down. And then when they wanted to film, they'd crank them all back up again, do the shot, and then crank them all back down again because it was getting so warm in there at Pinewood Studios. So that's sort of what we think is going on, is that they're blasting air conditioning at these folks. Now, I did find a note in here, just kind of hidden in the in between some of these other notes, where it basically mentioned that they did eventually swap the tank inside the spacesuit, the PLSS. Now, what's interesting about that is if you look at the cutaway shot of the suit, there really isn't any way to get to that tank. It's pretty embedded in the center of their back. It would have to be one guy opening that up, pulling it out, and putting another one in. Well, what's the guy do? In the meantime, while you pull that thing out, you can die instantaneously. There can never be an exposure of the vacuum of space to the astronaut's body. Otherwise, you just explode, right? No pressure and you pop. There's an old movie that Sean Connery was in back in the day. So supposedly they took most of the scuba diving kind of frogmen training technology theory, and they said that all the astronauts did that too. It's basically tethering I'll take my oxygen tether tube, put it on you, you're breathing my oxygen, I'm swapping you out, and then we take the tether off. And we're talking about so many little checks and balances to make sure, okay, you got your oxygen now? Is that coming from you or coming from me? Like, you have to figure out the system. So no details on that, but that's what they eventually claimed. So that Apollo 17 lasting 25 hours now has a claim that they were actually swapping these tanks out. Never heard that in all my other research. And if you've seen 10 years of this show, you know I've done a lot of research. But maybe with artificial intelligence, we're getting better aggregation of this stuff. But now, how many of you have a computer that uses water cooling tubes? And it just moves the water around. And those chips get really, really hot. I mean, I got a 4090 in my home computer at home, NVIDIA card, and that thing gets hot. And I probably have, 4 fans on the top, probably, 6 fans in the front, 3 in the back. I mean, and the cards have fans on them, so they do an amazing job circulating the water. I don't know if we're up to 250 up and 250 down, a 500 degree swing. Yay. Well, let's talk about those gloves. So the interesting thing was, when I asked the first question, I say, how do the fingertips work on these gloves? Because you're talking about almost a kinetic transfer of heat. Remember, heat is just atoms shaking, and cold is atoms not shaking at all. So either those tips are going to go absolute still, or they're going to be damn near on fire, right? Again, the first research I did on the Hasselblad cameras, I grew up with Hasselblad cameras. My father was a professional photographer. We owned 2 to 3 my entire lifetime. I've played with these things. I've taken 1 million photographs. I've been the kid that had to replace the backs when my dad's shooting some wedding or some event, right? These are the most precise cameras. They take 1 year to make. And there was an interview with the guy that built the cameras at Hasselblad. And he was sitting at his desk, and they had one of the cameras there, one of the dupes, right? And he said, what would happen if I took this camera and they moved it 280 degrees one way and 280 in the other way? That's where I got that number from. And the guy just paused, and you could see him computing in his head this whole thing was a hoax, because he immediately just said, it would explode. He goes, yeah, thank you very much. That's all we need to know. Plus the fact that these cameras didn't have any viewfinders in the top. The Hasselblad is a viewfinder. You look straight down. He used 120 film. Holds about 33 rolls. They had supposedly big giant backs on these things. Totally believable. Just add a bigger roll on the back, custom make the camera. to hold that big giant back, and you could get 100. I mean, who knows, right? But if you look at the photographs that Neil Armstrong took and others, they're Time Life cover photographs. So imagine I take you to Disneyland or California Park, and I put one of these things right on your chest, and you can't look down. And it's digital, whatever. You just take your cell phone and try this, right? Hold the camera to your chest and tell me you're going to frame a perfect shot of the castle, of Matterhorn, of Space Mountain, of a group of people. You're not going to be able to do it. And they said he trained for it, right? Well, yeah, give me a break, right? Again, I've lived with cameras. I take tons of photographs, and just getting a perfect shot without looking through it is just utterly insane. We just try to recreate a photograph we took last year on my birthday, for my birthday this year. And we must have taken 20 photographs because I'm not the guy holding the camera. I was the guy in the shot, right? And I said, look, there's a building in the background. I show the person the previous photograph. I said, this is what I'm looking for. I'm holding a cupcake. And I said, I just want to do a 1-year graduation shot of this thing. After 20 shots, just couldn't get through their head how to keep the building at the right depth. Couldn't figure out what the other photograph was. It's tough. It's tough to pull this off. And, every single time they did, it was great. Now, what's funny is once that started getting criticized online, the funny thing is that they introduced a bunch of bad photographs into the public eye. So they had gone nearly 20 years with this criticism, and then all of a sudden produced these photographs and said, oh, well, he took a bunch of bad photographs too. We just never showed them to you. Well, that's believable, even if he was looking through a viewfinder. But it really looks like to me that, you want money. You want money shots. You want amazing photographs to make sure the public's going to continue paying. I think it's up to $15 billion back in the 60s, which is now hundreds of, probably damn near $1 trillion at this point, right? But these gloves are just made out of, these tips are just made out of rubber and layers for comfort, this beta cloth, and some other stuff. There's nothing circulating through the fingertips. So it told me that the astronauts were complaining about their fingertips getting mostly cold. I think that was the funny one. There was never any complaint like they were on fire. Okay, so I guess you only have one problem, and then that's cold. So I think there would be terrifying. It's terrifying to burn. When you talk to people who get frostbite, the terrifying thing about frostbite, because I came from Kansas where people get stuck outside messing around and they just stay out too long, is you don't feel it occurring, because as you get cold, you're just roughing it out. Oh, my fingers are cold. Some people don't even feel that very much, right? But eventually you start necrosing. Your blood simply can't get to your capillaries. You can't get to your flesh, and it just starts cutting it off like a tourniquet. So you can get, if you had a finger, you could get, frostbite in the first joint of your finger headed toward your fingertip, and it's going to strangle your fingertip. But you can also get it obviously from your fingertip back. So these people come back in and they realize that they're going to have most of their limbs amputated, right? So the layers are an inner comfort layer, a pressure bladder, the restraint fabric, which is the beta cloth, which we're going to get to here. And then the outer protection layer with silicone rubber fingertips. So I don't know if any of you guys work in plastics or you know anything about silicone rubber. Just let me know. Can it survive 250 degrees for hours and hours and hours? And can it take a swing without actually losing its ability to stay attached to something, right? Even if it's got sort of like a gasket grabbing onto the edge of the fingertip, it just flexes and flexes and flexes, and eventually it might pop off, and then you're going to have a fingertip eating this horrible environment, right? Now let's get to the beta cloth. The beta cloth was, again, a result, and I've misquoted this date. It's weird how dates get reported incorrectly. I've said 1965 several times, but the Apollo 1 deaths of Gus Grissom, White, and Chaffee, Chaffee. This is a very interesting death. So what we think really took place, because the actual report to the wife and son of Gus Grissom indicates that they were murdered and not died in some fire was that he had been criticizing the entire program in 67, saying this thing is a lemon and ain't never going to the moon. We are a million miles away, which coincides with the Bill Casey claims, who was the head of documentation at NASA at the very, very tippy top. And he wrote that book in the 70s, and it was on Oprah, and he's the one that helped Bart Sibrel get started with his documentary. And I should note that if you go watch Bart Sibrel's interviews and his Moon Man book, he talks about the fact that he was actually going to make this in the early 90s, but he looked at his life expectancy as a result of doing it and said, no thanks, I want to have a wife and a kid, which he ended up doing at some point. Then he got a Bible and read it 3 times and realized, well, the truth needs to come out. And Casey's right there. And they went and approached another astronaut at NASA to get the funding for his movie. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Isn't that interesting, right? Well, if it's a big lie, why make a movie like this, right? It just causes problems for NASA with credibility and all that kind of stuff. So Gus went home the day before he died, and he told his wife, I don't know why, but there's an alphabet agency all over the tarmac. And there was basically a 10-inch thick 8x10 report that was given to Gus Grissom's wife. And they talked about replacing a switch on the dashboard. And that looks like the switch that would have been in a checklist that would cause the fire to occur. But the reality is, inside this report, it said their cause of death was cyanide. I kid you not. Okay? That's in the official report to the wife. Well, what if you need to get rid of a guy because he's causing problems? You're about to fake this whole thing and you don't need a guy proving that it was faked. You basically got a guy who's not on board with the lie. God bless these people, right? Well, the idea was that there was a pure oxygen environment inside the lunar capsule. They're just on the tarmac, just going through the motions, right? He's supposed to be the first guy on the moon, not Neil Armstrong. I mean, wow, what an interesting moral fabric this dude had to turn that down. So this fire, the way that we think it worked, and this is what the report said, is they first get cyanide poisoning and they die peacefully, right? Then the fire starts. The photographs of their bodies, which have been published, is pretty gruesome, but they just look like they sat in a chair burning. Now, the thing is they've got a door, okay? And it's supposed to have explosive bolts, just like every other aircraft out there or anything like that. They could have opened the door because you're not going to die instantaneously. You just won't. You've seen Formula One guys on fire before they had fireproof suits and that kind of stuff. You would open the door, yank the oxygen out, yank the fire out, and this thing would at least be reduced to a point where you could probably have some burns but survive. But none of that happened because they weren't alive when the fire starts. Goodbye, Gus. Goodbye, problem, right? But they use this as a catalyst to create this beta cloth, right? It's a money opportunity as well. It's not a bad idea, but I don't know how much stuff burns in a vacuum of space. And if you have a fire on the vehicle, you're probably dead anyway for many, many reasons. You're going to burn up all your oxygen supply. You're just, the problem with fires, okay, if you talk to a fireman, they always say to you, when a fire happens in your house, get down on your belly and breathe the air down towards the floor. And a lot of times it gets misconstrued as smoke inhalation will kill you. It will. It will kill you. But the thing that kills you is that smoke 3 feet up is 400 degrees. It could be 1,000 degrees at 5 feet where your mouth would normally be. You take in one breath of that heat, it's going to burn the sacs in your lungs and you'll never breathe again. There's nothing that anyone can do to save your life. You'd have to be on some artificial lung for the rest of your life. We can't grow those things back. At least not yet, right? So if it were to blow up inside the lunar capsule, they just be done. So I don't, whatever. It's good to insulate against heat, of course. And so I think this is where they incorporated it into the suit. But these are fiberglass filaments that are actually woven together, and then they're covered with Teflon to create this material. And it's supposedly, its melting point is 650 degrees Fahrenheit. So you would have to have some pretty intense burning, which is 340 degrees Celsius. The idea, though, if they're dealing with jet fuel, rocket fuel, all kinds of stuff. So any of that stuff was the problem. It would be like saying, if the just as long as the Challenger astronauts had fireproof suits, they'd be okay. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? If you have an explosion, you're going to die. The only thing you need to protect yourself against is the environment of the moon itself, which, regardless of Gus dying in the Apollo 1 fire, this is still a problem you got to solve on the moon. Now, the interesting thing is, I guess they're saying that Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 were able to figure out what the temperature was going to be like on the moon's surface. The reality is you're not going to know what the temperature is on the moon's surface until you're there. How many of you have got a sunburn skiing up in the hills or mountains of Colorado or some other location? It's the reflection of the sun off the snow that gives you a double dose, because you're first getting hit by the sun. It's beaming down on you, and then it's bouncing off the snow, giving you a marginal increase in your exposure to burning your skin, right? But this stuff, once developed, was applied to everything. So any type of Velcro base that the Velcro was attached to was always beta cloth. Everything was beta cloth. Everywhere any type of malleable surface needed to be generated, a notebook cover, any of that kind of stuff was always with this non-flammable cloth. Because it's made of this material too, it's not really susceptible to any fraying, any type of unwinding like a normal piece of, like my t-shirt. If I cut it, it'd start fraying where the hole is. None of that's going to happen because this stuff is really tough. Basically, if any of you have put on, fire gear just because you had access to it, your uncle was a fireman, or you're a fireman or firewoman, you know how heavy this stuff is. You don't want to wear it to a summer party, right? It's meant for fires and nothing else, right? Now, the other one was that they say that the flag that they planted was made of this beta cloth as well. I don't talk about the flag that much, but we have a good 60 seconds of the flag, and the only footage I've got is really super duper low res. But that flag was flopping in the air like absolute crazy. And why was it flopping in the air? Why was the dust flying away from their feet? Because all those gigantic air conditioners are blasting on them constantly. So when they set that flag up with the little metal rod that goes in the top, that base is just flapping all around. And the ridiculous excuse that they gave was that the astronaut bumped the pole with his foot, and the kinetic energy wiggled up the pole, went out the rod, and shook the flag. Absolutely insane. First day physics, you would never pass the most incredibly simple high school physics if you ever started such a thing. But of course, NASA just puts it out there. But only 5 seconds of that footage was ever broadcast, and it was 5 seconds where it behaved pretty normally. Now we'll talk about the Apollo guidance computer. And this is pretty interesting. And this is just, again, so you have some of the details of this kind of stuff. We're not messing around on the show. I just bumped the mic, created a big boom. Sorry about that. It's just so you know the details of any type of conversation you might have. There was a lot of engineering put into this, regardless if this thing was faked. And again, this technology is useful for 200-mile up low orbit stuff. It's still all very useful. And it does, because it's generated by your tax dollars, it does bleed into the private sector and become something else, right? But this is a system where they had a punch computer with a number pad, and various numbers put together will basically be a menu system. If any of you are old enough to remember DOS applications back in the day before we had the graphical user interface, the GUI interfaces, right? You start a DOS application and you get a choice, 1 through 8, or whatever it was, right? You click 2 and you go into the next menu. This video camera I used to film the show, it doesn't have numbers, but it's the same type of hierarchical menu, except they use numbers to trigger everything back in the day. The exact same system they built into this. Now, other than just punching in these menus and trying to come up with the commands that go into the computer, the only other thing that's sort of hard to believe, okay, was that they basically had 0 through 9. So 10 digits they could put in there. Nice thing about 0 through 9 is you don't have to type 10 to hit 10. You just type 0 and that's your last digit. Or if you're doing normal computer programming, 0 is 1, 9 is 10. The only problem with this type of interface, and they said that they practiced for hundreds of hours, and they would have had to program or test this for hundreds of hours. Again, it's like a Marine or any other big infantry guy who, my son-in-law is a Marine, he talks about going into warehouses, getting a particular gun, breaking the whole thing down in the dark, putting it all back together again, making sure it fires properly. You have to have a second sense to this, because the problem with this is that human error could cause the entire mission to go off. If those numbers are controlling thrusters and valves and all that kind of stuff, when to deploy stuff, you type an 8 instead of a 7. You're just bump it with your fingers wrong. Now, they're not wearing those gloves usually when they're using this kind of stuff. They're inside the lunar module trying to take off. They're inside the service module trying to control something. But any one of those mistakes, boy, it could be the difference between dying and being alive. So you can never make a mistake on a number pad, but you might have, 30 sequences you got to remember. Seems a little strange. It seems like that would be part of the rote memory, where you would literally have buttons with labels on them that go, I'm hitting this. Whatever you got to do to dump the right verbs into the computer, you're just going to do that. Retro rockets on, boom, stop. Go left, go right, that kind of stuff, right? But this was what they said they did to carry these missions through. So the descent of the lunar module. So remember what we were saying. You got the lunar module attached to the service module. The bullet with the little cone on the back is the service module, and the thing that with the legs that's going to land and leave its kickstand behind is the lunar module. Lunar as in landing on the moon, right? So when that thing detached, and you've seen the footage, the moon is booking underneath it, right? It's just, and it looks like they're way far away from the moon. They should be so close to the moon that you don't really see the edge of it. That's really how close they should be when they do this, but they weren't, okay? It's a two-stage process. The descent is going to blow a big chunk of the engine, the 10,000 pound thrust engine, easy for me to say. And then as it starts getting closer, it's got what they call accent thrusts. And so this is when the computer supposedly crashed. And again, you've seen the footage, you've seen how much land supposedly went under the lunar module. And I've showed you in the last video one of the tests that they did in sand, and they had a hell of a time trying to bring this thing in with any lateral movement, side-to-side movement, horizontal movement, and hit the ground. Now, the official story about the legs that hit the ground is that they have these boxes that as soon as it hits the ground, that those boxes crush. And it's a one-time deal. They crush. Now, I've never seen those boxes, because when you see the feet of the lunar module, which, by the way, have no dust on them whatsoever, and there doesn't appear to be any displacement of any of the ground underneath the lunar modules. Anytime you've ever seen them in photographs, they hired, Norman Rockwell to do a painting of what it might look like, because they thought, man, maybe a 10,000 pound thrust engine, even in accent mode, could dig a crater as it's landing. I mean, who knows we don't know how dense this dust would be on the moon, so you might dig a crater real quickly and you can't get out of it. You definitely couldn't get a rover out of the unit because you'd be on an incline, right? But of course, they never had any problems. And with all those gigantic rocks, they never landed on a rock. They just happened to know where everything was. It was interesting, right? And again, you could look at the desert of Arizona in America from a plane, 3,000 to 5,000 feet up, and it's going to look smooth as glass. But you can't land down there because there's cactus and there's divots in the ground, and you just can't do it. It's just too intense. So you always try to find a road. Now, if you had a biplane, you could probably pull that off, but you could still beat up a biplane so bad you couldn't take off again. So the fact that this unit has to land perfectly straight up and down, otherwise the detachment's not going to go in the right direction, right? Think about that. If you had to go a few thousand miles up in the air to rendezvous with the service module, or I should say even a few hundred miles, and you're off by a little bit, how could you possibly align to make the rendezvous up in space, right? But 6 out of 6 times, no problem. And of course, they're using a wild 3 chemical mixture to make sure this thing could burn without any other oxygen available. So they bring their oxygen with them. We've had one question about that a long time ago. Yeah, liquid oxygen is definitely the way that they they could most definitely bring these 3 different fuels up, and when they collide with each other, they just immediately explode, so you can actually make that occur. It's theoretically sound, at least. Now, one of the things, too, is that you always have to take whatever they claimed in these Apollo missions and fall back on one thing. Could that have ever been tested outside of that environment itself? Because what environment on Earth is ever going to mimic a vacuum of space and the surface of the moon? And the gravity of the moon and all that kind of stuff? You can't simulate that on Earth. You just can't. And again, I think Neil Armstrong nearly died in a test trying to simulate the lunar module on Earth, and it was just terrifying. They would put this thing on a tether on a crane, so it wouldn't necessarily just bang in the ground really bad, but he nearly died in one of these little tests, if I remember right. And that makes sense. But you don't go from near death all the time on Earth to cha-ching, it works perfectly on the moon in a place you've never been before, right? First time, every time. Now, I did a really funny analysis on this because you have 2 engines supposedly on this thing. You've got the thrust engine we've been talking about mounted in the bottom, which has to have enough engine mechanics above the cone to make this thing fire. And then supposedly inside that module that's going to take off second, you've got another engine stacked right on top of that one because it has to be dead center. It has to be, right? At least with their designs. So the idea that all of these engines are stacked right on top of each other is kind of ludicrous. And when you see it take off from the kickstand and go up, if you look at the footage I put in the video, as soon as it gets up a certain way, you'll see this glowing circle on the bottom of it. What's interesting about that is if you look at the frames before that glowing circle happens, it's smooth as glass. It's just a piece of metal underneath this thing. There's no cone, there's no nothing. But suddenly, when it gets up, you see it kind of tip forward as if it's trying to get that forward momentum I'm talking about. In all the notes from ChatGPT, they never talk about that directional correction, trying to catch up with the service module. And again, you're talking about trying to throw a needle across the room and the other person throws the thread and you're going to supposedly hit it through the needle, the eye of the needle. It's just never going to happen, okay? So now let's talk we only got 2 left, I think. And one is just the experiment package that went up there. Now, what's interesting about the experimental package is if we ever make it there, this package has to be on board. It just does. Because it's measuring all the good stuff you need to know about how the moon works, whether or not it has a magnetic pole, which is kind of funny. We should be able to sense that from Earth, I would think. But does it have earthquakes up there? You know, because like I think the moon Io of Jupiter has supposedly just earthquakes constantly because it's been ripped apart by its own core. It hasn't settled down yet. We couldn't live on that kind of environment. Volcanoes everywhere. And it's interesting how every moon we've ever looked at is completely categorically different in its composition. No 2 moons look the same, and ours is by far the most benign moon out there. Europa is an interesting experiment in ice, and it looks like the photos of Europa is, I think, the most convincing footage they've ever been out there to outer space, because if you take Neil Adams' expanding Earth theory and you look at all these highways all over the surface of Europa, either the artist that put that together knows about expanding Earth and put that into the model, which would be phenomenal. But if you take some of these gigantic highways and you collapse them like they don't exist, like the expansion is being reversed, a bunch of highways that go left and right all of a sudden come together perfectly. And the odds are just 0 that that's not an expansion model that they were at least mimicking, if not really taking a photograph of. But they wanted to know, does the moon have a seismic activity at all? And so they would put these little posts down into the ground and then see what would happen. The other one was, again, does it have a magnetic field? They wanted to know if there was any heat being registered differently on the surface of the moon, right? So put one in, have a little temperature gauge. Again, I don't think anything's happened, but brilliant idea. And then, of course, the solar radiation sensors. How much radiation do they have? ChatGPT at one point said that in all 6 missions, we're talking about the flight there, landing, spending time on the moon, and the flight back, that the sun never, ever produced a coronal mass ejection, because they can't really explain how you would survive such a thing. Because if you're outside the Van Allen belts, maybe you're going to get cooked. And even though, what you have to understand about CMEs is that 97%, this is just their science, right? 97% of a CME comes back to the sun. That means 3% is headed out to the vacuum of space. And, it's going to diffuse. It is going to diffuse. It's not going to stay in a big stripy, fire wave, just like some Nexus in Star Trek. It's going to diffuse. Now in high school astronomy, we had this great experiment. My high school teacher was beyond prodigy. He built his own telescope at the age of 13 by taking a piece of glass, putting it in a tree stump and sanding both sides of it. He'd flip it over and sand. He did it for like months and months and months, building his own lens telescope. At high school, he built his own star projector for us. I'm telling you, I have been in the Griffith Observatory. We had a Minolta star projector at De Anza College. I've seen the best star projectors in the world, and there was no difference between him drilling 1,200 stars on this piece of plastic sphere by hand, okay, varying all the drill bits to get the proper lumens coming out of all these holes. And I mean, he dropped the lights, and this thing was in my high school. I didn't even know. He built the dome, everything with all the students. So this guy's a genius, dude. So he took us out on one of our first days of astronomy, and he brought a basketball. But before he went outside, he said, okay, we need each one of you to be we need 9 of you to volunteer to be the planets. I volunteered for Earth. And so he goes, I'm going to tell each one of you how big to make a speck on a piece of paper in accordance with the sun being this basketball, which is 10 inches across, approximately. He told me the Earth was 1/3 of a period on a piece of paper. Obviously, the kid who had Jupiter got a much better registry on a piece of paper, but, Mercury just couldn't be represented on a piece of paper. If you just got a little atom of, carbon on this piece of paper, you had basically what Mercury was going to look like. So what he did was, and we have a big 3-story brownstone at the time of our school. So we went down to one edge of the school on the left. He put the ball, and he's marching us out to the point where the planets would be. I was 36 feet away from this ball. We got to, I think, Jupiter. We had to go a block and a half down the road. And then he says, we can't do any more. Because he said, let me just tell you where each one of you would be. And I forgot what he said, but it was miles and miles away for the final planets. And he said, who has Pluto? And so when it was that, he goes, okay, you'd be 500 miles from the North Pole. That's how far away this stuff is out there. Okay, well, at least according to that model, right? So now imagine this little 3% is diffusing. Now you have to have, there's a lot of space in space, okay? So what they try to tell you is every single time there's a coronal mass ejection, which is a very, very specific vector of some mass coming off the sun, that it's always hitting Earth. I mean, there's not one that doesn't hit Earth. It's just crazy, according to them. So by the time that 3% reaches this 36 feet away from a 10-inch ball, you're talking about nothing. You're talking about what runs into us, gets swallowed up by the Van Allen belts. You might get if you're in the Northern Lights time of the year, you might get a nice little echo in the atmosphere as that gets kind of charged up and dissipated. And of course, it's coming into the North Pole and going out the South Pole. You're not going to have much. So a lot of that's just kind of a scare tactic to make you believe that you need scientists to protect you from things. And again, if anything truly cosmic were to occur, what are they going to do? Seriously. There's a big asteroid headed towards Earth. There's nothing they can do. I mean, they can move that a fraction of a percent if they put every nuke in space and blew it up. It just would barely do anything. And then you might cause yourself a bigger problem, But they put a dust detector up there. You just want to kind of know what's going to be up there. Now, the funny thing about the dust detectors, there's no atmosphere, so it shouldn't be moving at all. If you put a footprint on the moon, it should stay there unless some other body from space nails it, right? They supposedly were checking for solar wind. They had solar panels, so you're looking at the efficiency of all that. They wanted to see about charged particle deflectors, and so they want to see about cosmic rays. And what's interesting about this is sort of on the very fringe of where science even theoretically was in 69 to 72. But, you could put sensors up there, do stuff. Again, Andromeda Strain, the movie, which is a fictional film, I think in 71. Michael Crichton, if it's not 71, it's 73. I did an episode on it. You should go see if you want to see the footnotes of that before you go watch the movie. If you haven't seen my movie reviews, They get confused for being the movies themselves. I get a tremendous amount of traffic, just people looking at it for a minute and a half going, what the hell is this? It's not THX 1138. You want to look through it because I'm giving you all the metadata about the creation of these films and their meaning to you in your life. I usually don't cover anything that doesn't have a direct impact. The only two movies I've done that doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on you is Tron and Blade Runner. That's it. But they had put a satellite into space as a result of Andromeda strain. Because at the beginning of that movie, they tell you it's not a fictional movie. It's actually a factual movie, which is a horrifying concept. And they said they were going to release all the paperwork to prove it was factual. And of course, that never happened. So it's just a fun little way to spin the film at the very beginning. But they were trying to put satellites in space and figure out sort of what's the sun creating for us? Is there any cosmic dust out there? So this is kind of stuff they were doing out there. All right, so let's finish off with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, or the LORE system. Now again, like I said at the beginning of the episode, this is a solution to bringing everything up to the moon like a 50s movie where you bring the whole Saturn V up there, you turn it around, you land it back down on its butt. It's sort of an insane theory when you really look at how we build stuff. We couldn't build the kind of rockets that were in the movies, right? Very small fuselages, all nice aerodynamic Buck Rogers stuff, and they have some super propellant that just barely needs to flow out of the engines to get up there. So there were 3 different models proposed, and one of them was the Buck Rogers one where they land up there. And then you have, and that was, the name of that was called direct ascent. So this was taking the whole thing up there. The other one was called Earth Orbit Rendezvous, which was they were going to go up there, construct a vehicle like von Braun said, and then go to the moon. They shot that down. And then this LORE system, this Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, was supposedly theorized by a guy, John Houbolt, Houbolt, Houbolt. And theoretically, in 1962, he wrote a letter. He was trying to get this pushed through, and he said, this is the only way this is ever going to work. It's pretty ingenious. I mean, if you really think about the theory of the Saturn V and the lunar module thing, it actually makes a lot of sense. There's just a hell of a lot of science we got to figure out before we can actually pull this thing off. And again, what they should do is take the Tic Tac and the gimbal technology, the gravity wave technology, and drive that to the moon, and you'd be fine. And if they do have bases on the moon right now, that's what they're using, okay? We'll get into that a little bit as the spin at the end of this episode here, but so this guy wrote a letter to the head of NASA, and he basically said in the letter, do you really want to go to the moon? Then this is the only way you can do it. And let's just review. You know this, right? So the Saturn V has got these stages, 3 massive stages that keep pushing that rocket up. And again, you saw this on camera. So this is really a low orbit vehicle. Okay, it doesn't really go to the moon, but it's ingenious. You have these massive Rocketdyne engines pushing that thing up, then that breaks off and falls away. Then you have second stage takes over. Then third stage is very minute, but it's really taking away the casing that's around the lunar module so they can do this amazing 180 turn, 180 back. But it was the way to create this forward momentum towards the moon, theoretically, right? Again, they don't do slingshot properly and that kind of stuff, as I mentioned in the last episode. But they're reducing all the weight. They're basically just immediately eliminating what they don't need. They've used that particular part of the vehicle up and it's gone. It's a brilliant idea. So hats off to the entire theory of the whole thing. And of course, it works for low orbit perfectly. Even with low orbit, you just really need the passengers to be where you want them to be, where the instrumentality needs to be to measure whatever the hell you want to measure. And again, they use it now supposedly for the space station and that kind of stuff. Again, see my space station episode if you want to have a massively detailed thing and fully understand the entire history of the space station. I got a bunch of 3D models animated of how that thing came together. And I will teach you which module belongs to which country and the order in which they were all assembled. And then I show you a ton of footage that's very questionable. So if you're into that conspiracy, you will definitely enjoy yourself. So there's not a reason to really beat this up with you guys. What they claimed was the spacewalk missions, the Gemini missions where they're getting out and, of course, You've got some funky stop animation stuff going on where, one of the astronauts comes out and he turns his head towards the camera and waves, right? That helmet doesn't turn. It just doesn't. To turn it is to take it off. And then, of course, all of our guys in the industrial backgrounds, which there's many of you watching the show that tell me all over and over beautifully in the comments, the gaskets just don't work in space. When you push the AIs on that, they just make up a bunch of hoopla. They just basically say, they made some special gaskets that do work in space. And so it worked, That's mostly the answers you get if you try to debate any of the facts. They just say it worked. That's it. And they say, yeah, it's just amazing. It's amazing how that worked. And then you take like the O-rings of the Challenger, which are well below the temperatures, or the 0 Kelvin temperature, well above, I guess, the 0 Kelvin temperatures in space, and it breaks and explodes and kills everybody, But now let's kind of divert away from the specifics of this episode, since you made it this far. Thank you for continuing to listen here. I do want to say ads are now available, running on my episodes again. What's going on is YouTube, after 4 years, they knocked me out just before the election in 2020. Like, they were really worried. They canceled a ton of channels and all that kind of stuff. So after 4 years of petitioning this thing, they finally let it turn back on. So what they have done is they have automated all the ads for the old videos. And since no one tends to go backwards, I'm not going back to doing a lot of editing on this. But what I have to do is when I publish a video, it puts in like 20 ads that might run if you're watching the channel. Depends on what you've seen in other videos. They won't inundate you too much. What I'm doing is I'm reducing this to 3 ads. So one at the beginning, maybe, one in the middle, directly in the center, and one at the end. That's it. So I'm taking a lot of cash and throwing it out the window to make sure you guys don't get too bogged down. If you watch it from other resources, you still get ads on BitChute and Rumble. So it's actually fewer ads on YouTube, just so that you know. And of course, if you listen to the podcast, you don't get any ads, but then you don't get the pictures and the proof. So there has been numerous different stories from different sources talking about soldiers coming back from the dark side of the moon. Why the dark side? Well, it's romantic that way, because that way no one can see what you're doing. You could build a whole base up there, and technically speaking, you might do that anyway. But how cold is the dark, right? The dark side of the moon would be always negative 250. And if you've seen pictures of the dark side of the moon, it's the catcher's mitt for everything that might be coming at the moon from outer space, right? Now, on this channel, I've always told you, I think it's sort of ludicrous that every single crater on the moon is perfectly circular. When I was interviewing Bart Sabrell, I mentioned this to him. He didn't have any interest in it, which I thought was a little disappointing. It's like, I guess he's just really focused on his wheelhouse. He's really worried about any other theory that interferes with proving that we didn't go to the moon. So he really kind of gets understandably edgy when anything diverts away from his core focus. And I get it. But at some point, a meteorite is going to slam into the moon if they exist the way that they prophesize they exist, and it's going to create a nice oval. It's going to create a nice streak across the surface of the moon. It just would. Now, if you ask an AI, they'll say, oh no, every single rock that ever hits the moon is in a perfect trajectory to come down perpendicular to the surface of the moon. I think they're volcanic eruptions. That's what I think they are. And that's why every once in a while, one of the craters on the moon actually glows. It actually glows in the center, because that's the plasma energy from the inner core of the moon leaking out through the center. That's why they'll glow phosphorus white for a week or so, and then they go back dead again. It happens all the time on Earth with our old volcanoes that are considered dead, and then every once in a while they start kind of heating up again, and then they go cold again. It's the same book of physics everywhere in the universe, right? We don't have 2 books of physics, okay? But we've seen this gimbal technology. We have seen, and there's been a recent video release that basically showed a JDAM missile was fired at the Tic Tac, and it bounced off the Tic Tac. And what also happened, and this is fully explained by what we tell you that Tic Tac is on this show, the Tic Tac actually goes into a wobbling spin, but a lot of the debris from the impact actually stays around the vehicle and gets dragged with the vehicle. It never loses its forward momentum. Like it doesn't slow down or anything. Okay. Well, I've told you that, I was fortunate enough to work with this futuristic designer, Sid Mead, for 20 years. And he did some covert Air Force paintings, which are no longer covert. And that crew would come back and visit him at his house, and they would just brag about anti-gravity all the time. And they said, we used to spend, toruses of mercury, like you saw in Iron Man at the Stark Enterprises lobby, to create energy. And then we realized there's a solid state way of doing it where you have no moving parts, and it's just fabulous, right? It's more like the Bob Lazar technology he talked about. I don't think Bob Lazar is telling the truth unless they messed with his brain. But his stories grew over the years, right? He missed all these details in 89. Then suddenly in 2000, oh boy, the same exact experience he's mentioning, 80% more content that you would never forget, okay? Go see my episode on Bob Lazar. But if you create a gravity well technology, and for those of you who've never seen an episode before, I'll just explain it super simple. Take the Tic Tac, which is 40 feet long. Okay, this is not a little Tic Tac flying in the air, like a breath mint Tic Tac, right? This thing's 40 feet. It's like a big ass missile. It is basically pushing the fabric of the universe away from its tip, okay? Thus getting rid of any gravity that might be pushing down on it or pushing against it. The whole entropy of the universe is removed within this gravity well in front of it. So the vehicle is falling into the gravity well. It probably also has a wild kind of algorithm that goes around the vehicle as well, because it's going to have to reconstitute that around it when it punches through it, right? We're talking about a technology that doesn't leave a sound wave behind, because the sound is actually distorting around the vehicle being put back in place. It's all the air that was there doesn't slam against itself and create a sonic boom. So this thing can be all over the place. Now, it's on a war level, that's an unbelievably terrifying weapon. I mean, you're talking about putting a Tic Tac in your major city of anybody you don't like and just blowing the thing up, and a 40-foot package, it must be at least 10 feet in diameter. Think about what you could hold inside that thing. I mean, I don't know how packed the thing is with the actual mechanism that makes it fly, but we're talking about the ability to do some pretty bad damage. Now, forget about war. Talk about the moon. Talk about the theory of having any base on the moon, whether it be on the crust, on the side of the shadow with the light, so you can kind of enjoy both sides of the thing, but you're not showing up on a telescope from an amateur high school teacher trying to show his kids things. But if you use that technology and you could ferry up, and you don't have to paint it white, you could paint it black, I think. I don't think there's any color paint job problem with this technology. You could take those things off in droves and carry up all kinds of equipment. And so that when this thing arrives, you could use robots to do it, Boston Dynamic robots kind of stuff, or, that's what we're allowed to see. I'm just theorizing that perhaps they have much better units that are working on that. But even if humans in some sort of suit or something that lands and unfolds and something else lands and you got to move it in place and it unfolds, if you have the precision of that vehicle and you have just markers on whatever's opening up, then the other one comes in, looks down, finds the markers, aligns, attaches, unfolds, and you just keep doing that all day. You could have a base built before any human being tries to get inside the place, right? You could have a heater. You could bring a nuclear reactor. You really wouldn't want for anything other than oxygen and food. That's the main two things you'd have to have, right? Now, I don't know what the strategic sort of advantage would be of having a base in an extremely hostile area. Any of you saw 2001: A Space Odyssey? When Floyd leaves the wheel in space and he goes to the moon, you'll know that there's this beautiful sequence. They had a base in the moon's belly. Not the belly, but in the crust, and this aperture, door opens up, and the craft goes down, and then this elevator came up to grab it, and it lands on the elevator, goes down, and the door shuts, and now you're in this controlled environment. Who knows? Man has built all kinds of wild stuff on Earth that's just, unimaginable. Any of you have seen Indiana Jones 3 with the father, and you see the treasury at the end in Petra. That incredible, I did a whole episode on this. Can't remember exactly which one I did it on, but it was the It was the ancient megalithic structures. I think it's a two-parter. They carved this into the mountain, and you go inside the treasury. The inside of the treasury is not what you see in the movie. In fact, I rewatched that movie a couple months ago, and I realized it's all blue screen. The actors were never there. So the Unit 2 went over and shot those beautiful clips of that place, and then everybody's in blue screen or some prop anytime they're shown in there. But anyway, if you go in, it's a mitered room. I mean, it's a big-ass room, perfect 90-degree angle stuff. So we've built some amazing stuff here on Earth. And I mean, just imagine bringing the equipment we have today. So, I know that John Lear, he likes to say we found lots of moon bases built by other civilizations, and every once in a while we'll see a little clip go around where they'll try to tell you this little vehicle is kind of crawling across the surface. Who knows? Maybe that's one of our vehicles. It's hard to believe that that there would be an extraterrestrial presence that wouldn't be visible. There's a couple astronauts that said, "Oh man, we couldn't go back to the moon because we met aliens," and they said, "Get out of here, this is ours." And it's like, okay, we have telescope arrays in the desert. One of my other proofs from a NASA employee relates to this. I'm at my buddy's restaurant. He had a buddy of his who was a super high clearance NASA guy. And he sits him down in front of me and he goes, "Oh, you guys should talk, man," because he says we didn't land on the moon. And the guy in front of me sits down and he can't make eye contact with me, which was kind of funny. This guy's probably in his 40s. And he says, "Well, anyone that doesn't think we went to the moon is just an asshole." And so I'm staring straight at him. I'm just like, okay, I've been debriefed by the other side, right? So for me, it's like, I understand. I'm not here to change your mind or anything. But I said, let me ask you, I said, with the telescope arrays that we have today, don't you think it's possible that we could take a photograph of any one of the landing sites here on Earth, even with our atmosphere in the way, and see some of those landing sites? Don't you think we could pull it off without a reconnaissance satellite? Don't you think we could get amazing shots of the surface of the Earth? Because at that time, I was really heavily researching that. And this is when I say telescope array, we're talking about the ones that have thousands of hexagonal mirrors that take gigantic deep space pictures, and then they actually use software to see how those reflective mirrors might have been torqued and bent by the weather. And they do algorithms to bend all that light back into place. I mean, it's beyond brilliant stuff. And most of the public doesn't even know these things exist. And they have existed for 30 years plus. This dude laughs his head off in front of me and starts kind of drawing on the table in front of me. He goes, "Yeah, you're right." Because we could totally take that picture. And so he just let go. He let go right in front of me. And I didn't push him anymore. I didn't push him for any other theories. I didn't get a big debate with him on anything. And that was just another confirmation to me that, he just said that as a defense mechanism, trying to see if I'd crack. I didn't crack. I just gave him a nice, and it was funny thing was I didn't realize this guy was in the room, and I'd never asked another human being that question before. But so if you find yourself in those questions or in that situation, you might pose some of the stuff we talked about. Again, never taken a video of the moon or a video of Earth from the moon. But the other one I thought I would just throw at you because I got a little time on my stick here is that if you're on the moon, let's put it this way, let's reverse it. You're on Earth and you can see the moon. That moon is always showing us the same face, always, right? So if your grandpa took a picture of the moon back in the day and you took a picture of the moon and he was 15 when he took that picture and you're 15 when you take that picture, it's the same moon. It doesn't rotate, right? We don't see the dark side of the moon on some of the days, right? So if you're on the surface of the moon, especially in the Sea of Tranquility and those nice center smooth areas, where is Earth always going to be? Is it going to be off on the horizon? Nope. It's going to be straight up in the air. Straight up in the air, okay? And so when you see photos of a crescent Earth off to the distance, that has to be taken from the service module. And some of them were supposedly taken from the service module, supposedly, right? They're not videos, they're pictures. And again, Bart Sabrell's dad was, I believe, in the Air Force. And so he was a space kid like me. He believed everything, just like I did, until he saw Bill Casing's interview on Oprah. And he's like, whoa. His father was given this commemorative book on the moon landings. It was just an inter-circulated military thing. Of course, books are being published through editors as well for the public. But these first pictures had two different types of black in them. And so you would see the astronauts on the moon photographs, and as soon as the hills were finished in the shot, the black above the hills was a different black. Like it had been added to the photograph to blank out anything like girders or weird stuff that might have shown up in the photograph. Makes sense because they're not really there and there's no stars in space. Remember, Sirius is a star that's brighter than the moon. Okay. So there's some stars that are always going to make it in the shot. Okay. And they're not in any shot. But any photographs of the Earth would have been straight up because that's where it is. If you're on the surface of the moon, it's the same face that always faces the moon. Faces Earth. Gosh, it's hard to keep straight, isn't it? But some of the other interesting smoking guns is obviously you have to just say 1/4-inch aluminum doesn't protect astronauts against solar radiation. It doesn't protect against any radiation, let alone the Van Allen belts, right? The funny thing, too, is if you ask ChatGPT, how many miles did any one of the Apollo missions travel to get to the moon? They just says right off the bat, 240,000 miles, which is only a couple thousand miles more than just directly going there, right? But they're not traveling that way, right? Because of the slingshot thing. You have to add up all the miles. They're going supposedly in this slingshot technique, which of course is misrepresented in all the diagrams from the 60s and 70s as just one little half trip around the moon and then or the Earth, and then it's straight to the moon, right? But if you really push in the true technique that would have to occur, you'd have to go around the Earth several times to catch that gravity wave to go over to the moon. And you'd have to descent down into orbit around the moon. None of that's ever accounted for, right? So the distance of travel is going to be a lot more than a direct trip straight from Florida right to the moon, right? So if they were to go straight through the Van Allen belts at, say, 17,000 miles an hour, yeah, you'd be a little over an hour to get through 20,000 miles of the Van Allen belts, right? However, you're not. You're going through the Van Allen belts in a diagonal line. So you're always just getting consumed by this electromagnetic field, which would kill everybody inside the vehicle. But let's just say you give that part to them. It's a mysterious thing that just happened. And then you got the film and the cameras, right? So anything that's film-based, not electrically broadcast to Earth cameras, all the Hasselblad shots will get eaten alive by this radiation. They just would, let alone the camera exploding in this temperature discrepancy between 240 or 250 up and 250 down. Just use their new reduced temperature. That's enough. That's a 500-degree swing, right? And one of the other funny ones that happened is the famous Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, which NVIDIA tried to prove was just ambient light because he's fully lit coming down off this ladder, but it's on the backside of the lunar module. Now, NVIDIA tried to do this simulation because they're all in this bed together, right? Someone calls the guy and says, could you use, a presentation to prove that this is actually not a hoax, right? Well, Hollywood just happens to have some software that they developed for taking live action shots and reconstructing the lights in the room so that when they put it in a CG environment, which means everything else that's not the object you filmed, fits in the lighting perfectly. So they have to light this virtual set to match the live action set. And they ran that software against that picture of Buzz coming down off the ladder, and it came back with like 5 lights systems, right? One of my buddies from Blender looked at the shot. He's a pixel god. He created all those Blender, Blizzard, those cutscenes for World of Warcraft and StarCraft and Diablo. This guy is one of the tippy top dudes, if not the top guy. And I made him look at it because he never really considered it either. And he just goes, oh my God, I could see 4 or 5 lights already. He goes, there. And I was just like, wow, this guy's eyeball is super educated. So when you work with these individuals for 25, 30 years and they're your best friends and you sit down with them and they don't have any vested interest in debunking anything, it starts to shine a whole new light on kind of what's going on there, right? So I looked up the spacecraft, and I do apologize in my Artemis episode. I forgot to ask what vehicle specifically is scheduled to land on the moon so they can spend a week there and then land on the moon to stay and build a space station, right? Well, they're basically saying 100% it's going to be SpaceX's Starship. Funny thing is I have an extremely close friend of mine who believes we went to the moon, all that good stuff, and he is a SpaceX addict. This guy knows everything about everything, all their rocket migrations from when they first started the company to the ones they have now. He has a full he has, I don't even know what scale it is. It's probably about, when you put it all together, he's got a Starship model. It's probably about 3 feet, 4 feet tall when you put it on the ground. He's got the landing unit and the kickstand, all that stuff, man, in his office. And I told him that NASA had claimed that the Starship's going to be ready by 2028. And you should have seen the expression on his face. He's a super fan of this whole organization. He just went, no way. He goes, no way. He goes, that thing is so not ready for the moon. He goes, man, we can't even get that thing in orbit. He says, just forget about it being ready at that time, right? And so I was trying to ask him, I said, what do you think, 2030? It's 2 more years of development. What do you think? And he's like, nah. He goes, I don't know. He goes, it's not going to happen, I mean, maybe indeed they do figure out a way to do that. But imagine you take a hybrid of technology. Let's say you have the Tic Tac and gimbal technology, right? It just creates a gravity well. Well, imagine you actually covertly put the gravity well technology inside a Starship. Now you have the boosters that are going to send it up a certain distance, but when you have to do the 0 atmosphere vacuum travel, you switch to the other technology, which may be a lot smaller than fuel tanks and rocket boosters, and suddenly the vehicle's going towards the moon, right? Now, of course, you'd have to have done this several times before to make sure that you're not running into a bunch of anomalies you never calculated. Again, you do all this Black Ops stuff and you figure all the technology out and you're like, okay, here's what you're going to do. Your scientists are going to meet our scientists and we're going to black box the whole thing so you don't know what's actually going on here, but we've looked at your Starship. You're going to have to make certain modifications to the fuselage to hold this thing. You only need this much booster stuff because, eventually when it's out of sight, out of mind, our thing will turn on and take you the whole distance, right? And quite frankly, with AI, imagine you had AI super educated to create starships and thrust and Earth and the moon surface, and you take all those telescope arrays and you do map the surface of the moon absolutely perfectly. So whatever's there is on camera, and then you just tell the AI to handle this shot, that shot, and you're not going to be able to tell the difference. You simply won't. Even I will have a huge problem telling the difference. It's all going to be predicated on the physics that they say is involved with the moon's surface, right? Maybe the moon's surface is like an ocean. You touch it and the whole thing goes, whoa, like a waterbed. Who knows, right? It doesn't look like it's like that because it's been definitely pockmarked and it looks like it has pretty huge mountains on it and that kind of stuff. But something to keep in mind if they ever go and they're showing you footage of it, right? Because think about where AI is going to be movie-wise in 2 years. I mean, we're almost at a point now where live action can be completely replaced. So this is part 1. It'll probably take me a while to put together a part 2, so don't expect that next. But I want to put part 1 just in case we go into other technologies that are going on the moon that we want to talk about. There's definitely, the details of certain things. I don't know how interesting it would be if I can consume the normal time I usually consume on that, but definitely put your suggestions in the comment section. Any comments you have, if I left something out, when I was talking about one of the 10 subjects that piques your interest, we'll get to it. If you have not been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. It's got 3 different video feeds. The podcast is up there. There's a store with some pretty cool shirts. We do have a separate channel on YouTube for season 1. So a lot of you, about a little under 500 of you have subscribed over there. Yeah, we're definitely getting more viewership now, just a tiny bit. Subscriptions are super duper low. If you think this channel should have more subscribers, just put the videos out there. Definitely make sure you understand this will be somewhere like 822 episodes I've done. I used to do political episodes. I really found that those just aged really badly. I change my opinion or new data comes in and makes me look like an idiot. So I stopped doing those because we just want to kind of divorce ourselves from that stuff. You have other arteries to grab, that kind of stuff. YouTube's probably knocked off about 50 videos. So there should be at least 720 something up there. But make sure you go back and watch some of the old stuff. I know some of the stuff's in black and white. That was kind of a cool thing. I still have listeners that are very depressed this is in color. But I used to have a house down the street. The woman who owned the house passed away. That's why I don't have access to the house anymore. And the prices for houses like that went triple. So I'm still looking for, I got a place that might come up, but it just, I want it 20 years if I get a new place. So that's why filming here is pretty cool too, right? Smoke my stogies, no problem. And it's indoors, so I can smoke when it's freezing outside and when it's hot outside. I got an air conditioner and a heater just in case. I'm loving it. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.